The DeFeo Family Massacre. 6 dead in Amityville Horror, November 13, 1974. 6 people were shot to death in their beds in Amityville, New York. All family members, all sleeping peacefully. The killings were execution style, cold and methodical. The perpetrator wasn't a stranger, wasn't an intruder, wasn't even a rival gang member. He was Ronald DeFeo Jr., the eldest son, who systematically murdered his entire family with a .35 caliber Marlin rifle. Prosecutors would later call it one of the most heinous family annihilations in American history. But the reason behind the bloodshed wasn't money, wasn't robbery, wasn't even self-defense. It was voices in his head, demonic possession he claimed, and a hatred so deep it could only end in blood. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Amityville sprawled across 2.3 square miles of waterfront property on the south shore of Long Island. Population 9,441, scattered between colonial homes, Cape Cod cottages, and Dutch colonials that lined quiet streets named after Revolutionary War heroes and Native American tribes who de-inhabited this land centuries before. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business, where children rode bikes until streetlights came on, and where the biggest news was usually about high school football gangs or local zoning disputes. The village had been incorporated in 1894, growing from a small fishing and oystering community into a comfortable bedroom community for people who worked in Manhattan but wanted to raise their Rees there. Families somewhere that felt safe, somewhere that still had that small town America feeling that was disappearing in places like Queens and Brooklyn. By 1974, Amityville was solidly middle class, a mix of Italian-American, Irish-American, and German-American families who'd made the migration from the city a generation earlier. Ocean Avenue, where the DeFeos lived, was one of the most desirable streets in town. Large homes set back from the road, most built in the 1920s and 1930s, when waterfront property was still affordable for ordinary working people. The houses had character, history, stories of families who'd lived in them for decades. Some had been passed down through generations. Others, like 112 Ocean Avenue, had changed hands a few times, but always to families looking for the American dream in its most literal form. A house with a yard, a neighborhood where kids could play safely, and enough distance from the city to feel like escape. November in Amityville meant temperatures hovering in the low 40s, crisp and cold. The air hung thick with moisture from the Great South Bay, mixed with wood smoke from fireplaces and salt from the ocean wind. The trees along Ocean Avenue had lost most of their leaves by mid-November, branches reaching toward gray skies like skeletal hands. At night you could hear foghorns from the boats, and when the wind blew right, you could smell the clam flats exposed at low tide. That particular combination of brine and decay that coastal residents either loved or hated, but everyone recognized instantly. The Great South Bay itself was a working waterway in 1974. Commercial fishing boats still operated, though declining catches and stricter regulations were making it harder every year. Recreational boaters used the waters in summer, their docks and moorings empty now in November, boats winterized and covered. The bay connected to the Atlantic Ocean through several inlets, bringing tides that rose and fell with mathematical precision, reshaping the shoreline twice daily in ways that residents had learned to read like a clock. But 1974 was a troubled year for America, for Long Island, for Amityville. The nation was still reeling from Watergate. Nixon had resigned in August after 2 years of scandal and investigation that had torn apart any remaining faith in government institutions. Gerald Ford, the unelected president, was trying to heal a nation that didn't want to be healed, that wanted accountability and justice, and felt cheated by the pardon he granted Nixon just a month into his presidency. Inflation was spiraling out of control, reaching rates not seen since the end of World War II. A gallon of milk that cost 49 cents in 1970 now cost 89 cents. Gasoline, if you could find it during the ongoing energy crisis, cost 55 cents a gallon, double what it had been 2 years earlier. The oil embargo by OPEC nations had sent shockwaves through an economy built on cheap energy and unlimited consumption. Lines at gas stations stretched for blocks. Rationing based on license plate numbers became common. The optimism and prosperity of the 1960s felt like ancient history. The economic boom of the post-war decades felt like a distant memory. Even in comfortable suburban Amityville, families were feeling the squeeze. Property taxes were rising faster than wages. Suffolk County was in financial trouble, cutting services while raising taxes to cover budget shortfalls. Good jobs were harder to find. Graduates from local high schools, who might have expected to walk into factory jobs or skilled trades, were finding those positions filled by older workers who couldn't afford to retire. The promise that each generation would do better than the previous one was starting to ring hollow. Even the middle-class families of Ocean Avenue, people like the DeFeos, who seemed comfortable from the outside, were struggling. The facade of prosperity hid mounting debts, second mortgages, credit card balances that never seemed to decrease. Keeping up appearances became a full-time job. New cars in the driveway, even if you couldn't afford the payments. Nice clothes for the kids, even if you couldn't pay the heating bill. The suburban dream was becoming a suburban prison. All appearances and no substance. In that economic and cultural uncertainty, some families turned inward, focusing on keeping up appearances while chaos brewed behind closed doors. Not the kind of chaos you'd see on the nightly news. This was business as usual for dysfunctional American families. Alcoholism that started as social drinking at backyard barbecues and morphed into daily necessity, bottles hidden in garages and basements. Violence that erupted over small disagreements, raised voices turning to raised hands, and rage that simmered just beneath the surface of polite suburban life, everyone smiling at church on Sunday, while harboring resentments that grew darker and deeper with each passing year. The neighborhood of Ocean Avenue provided everything a family could want on paper. Waterfront properties worth significant money even in a down market. Well-maintained homes with manicured lawns and fresh paint. Good schools nearby, where teachers still commanded respect and graduation rates stayed high. And a sense of safety that came from tree-lined streets, where everyone knew everyone and strangers stood out immediately. The Suffolk County Police Department maintained regular patrols, officers who'd grown up in the area and knew most residents by name. Crime in Amityville was mostly petty stuff. Teenagers breaking into summer houses during winter. Occasional domestic disputes that neighbors called in when the screaming got too loud. Bar fights on Friday nights that ended with warnings rather than arrests. Serious crime, the kind that made newspapers and frightened people, was something that happened in the city, in rough neighborhoods, to people who were asking for it somehow. The FBI presence was theoretical at best. Federal agents had jurisdiction, but rarely exercised it. In Amityville, the law was visible but comfortably distant, dealing mostly with traffic violations and domestic disturbances that neighbors politely ignored unless they got too loud or too frequent. The unspoken rule was that what happened inside a man's home was his business, unless someone ended up in the hospital or dead. That distance, that hands-off approach, that cultural assumption that families could and should handle their own problems, would prove catastrophic for the DeFeo family. Because when a young man starts threatening his family with loaded weapons, when his drug addiction becomes obvious to everyone, when his violence escalates from words to actions, and nobody intervenes because it's a family matter, a private thing, something they'll work out themselves, the stage is set for tragedy. Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. was 23 years old that November, though his behavior made him seem younger, more volatile, less mature than his years suggested. 5 feet 10 inches tall, 180 pounds, built from sporadic weightlifting and natural bulk rather than discipline. His hands were large and calloused, thick-fingered from occasional work at his grandfather's car dealership. A curved scar ran from his left eyebrow down to his cheekbone, a souvenir from a childhood accident with a car door that had required 12 stitches and left him unconscious for several minutes, the first of many head injuries he'd sustain over his life. Born September 26, 1951, Ronnie had entered the world during the height of American prosperity. His father, Ronald Sr., was establishing himself in the family business. His mother, Louise, was 20 years old, a young bride trying to figure out motherhood while maintaining a household. Ronnie was their first child, the son who would carry on the family name, the boy who would inherit the business and make them proud. The early years had been good, normal, unremarkable. Ronnie learned to walk and talk at appropriate ages. He played with neighborhood kids. He attended St. Martin of Tours Catholic School, where the nuns taught reading, writing, and discipline in equal measure. His first-grade teacher described him as energetic but manageable, bright but easily distracted. His parents saw nothing concerning, nothing that suggested the violence that would come later. But something changed around age 10. Maybe it was the birth of younger siblings, suddenly finding himself no longer the center of attention. Maybe it was the head injuries, 3 documented concussions by age 12 from sports and roughhousing. Maybe it was genetic, some inherited predisposition toward mental illness that ran in the family, but nobody talked about openly. Whatever the cause, Ronnie began showing signs of something darker. He killed neighborhood pets, always claiming they were accidents. A cat that fell from a tree, he chased it up. A dog that ate poison, he swore he didn't leave out. Small cruelties that concerned his parents, but that they explained away as rough play, as boys being boys, as accidents that could happen to anyone. They were working-class people in the 1960s. Therapy was for rich people with nothing better to do. You dealt with problems at home, with discipline and structure and time. By high school, Ronnie was using drugs. Started with marijuana at 14, moved to heroin by 16. He failed classes despite above-average intelligence. He got into fights, vicious ones where he didn't stop when his opponent was down. He stole from his family to fund his habit. He threatened teachers when they tried to discipline him. He was suspended multiple times, eventually dropping out at 17 without graduating. His relationship with his father deteriorated into something toxic, each man seeing the worst of himself reflected in the other. Ronald Sr. had worked so hard to give his son opportunities he'd never had, and Ronnie threw them all away. Every job lasted weeks before he was fired for not showing up or showing up high. Every attempt to get clean lasted days before he was using again. Every promise to do better was broken before the words stopped echoing. The violence escalated. At 19, Ronnie pointed a loaded shotgun at his father during an argument about money. Louise called the police, then convinced them not to arrest her son. Just scared him straight. Just gave him a warning. The warning did nothing. At 21, he beat his younger brother Mark, badly enough to require a hospital visit for a concussion. The family explained it as an accident, boys roughhousing, nothing serious. Every morning, Ronnie DeFeo woke late, usually around 10 or 11, stumbled to the bathroom for aspirin to combat his perpetual hangover, and contemplated whether he'd actually show up to work at his grandfather's Buick dealership in Brooklyn. He'd shower, throw on jeans and whatever shirt was cleanest, and maybe head to work, maybe not. His attendance was legendary for all the wrong reasons. The kind of employee who showed up 3 days one week, vanished for 5 days the next, always with excuses that wore thinner with each repetition. The dealership job was pure nepotism. His grandfather Rocco trying to help his daughter's troubled son, giving him chance after chance that any other employee would have been fired for wasting. The pay was decent, $225 a week for work. Ronnie maybe did half-assedly when he bothered to show up at all. His co-workers resented him. This druggie who made as much as them while doing a fraction of the work, protected by family connections from consequences, that would have destroyed anyone else's career. He'd never married, never held down a real relationship, spent most of his time drinking with friends in local bars or getting high in someone's basement. He had a girlfriend named Sherry Klein, but their relationship was tumultuous, marked by his jealousy and her growing fear of his explosive temper. She told friends she was thinking of ending things, but hadn't worked up the courage yet. When Ronnie was good, he was charming, funny, the life of the party. When he was bad, he was terrifying, possessive, violent in ways that left her shaking and making excuses for why she couldn't see friends. What Ronnie valued most wasn't accomplishment, wasn't relationships, wasn't building anything lasting. Though he needed money desperately and constantly, burning through his paycheck in days on drugs and drinking, what he valued was respect, the kind you couldn't earn through kindness or hard work. His grandfather Rocco had built a successful business through decades of 16-hour days and shrewd dealing, arriving in America with nothing and creating something substantial. His father Ronald Sr. had maintained that success, expanded it, become a pillar of the business community, someone people called sir and treated with deference. Ronnie saw respect as something you demanded, something you took by force if necessary, something proven through intimidation. He carried guns, multiple firearms that he either bought or stolen or received as gifts. He brandished them in bars when he felt disrespected. He pointed them at people during arguments. He fired them in the air to make points in disagreements. The local police knew about it, had been called multiple times, but always the family intervened. Always someone smoothed things over. Always Ronnie avoided real consequences. The rifle itself had cost him nothing, a gift from his father years earlier for hunting. That Marlin .35 caliber lever-action rifle represented everything. His masculinity, his power, his ability to command fear when words and fists weren't enough. He kept it in his bedroom closet, loaded, ready, a security blanket for a man who felt constantly under threat, even when no real danger existed. That rifle would become the instrument of his family's destruction, the tool that transformed dysfunctional family dynamics into national tragedy. By November 1974, Ronnie DeFeo had become a powder keg waiting for a spark. Drug-addicted, violent, increasingly paranoid, hearing voices that either represented genuine psychotic break or convenient excuse, depending on who you asked. His family was terrified of him, but couldn't bring themselves to permanently remove him from their lives. Cultural expectations about family loyalty, about not abandoning your children no matter what, about handling problems privately, all combined to keep Ronnie in that house even as the danger became increasingly obvious. The DeFeo family wasn't what outsiders saw them as. From the street, from church on Sundays, from interactions at the grocery store or the dealership, they looked like the model American family. A hard-working father, a devoted mother, 5 children ranging from young adults to young children. They owned their home. They had steady income. They drove nice cars. They dressed well. Everything on the surface suggested success and stability. Ronald DeFeo Sr. was 43, a stocky man with graying hair combed back in the style of the era, a prominent nose that gave his face character, and intense dark eyes that could shift from warm to intimidating in seconds. He had built a comfortable life as service manager at his father-in-law Rocco's Buick dealership in Brooklyn, a position that combined mechanical knowledge with business acumen and people skills. He was earning good money, somewhere around $30,000 a year, which was solidly middle class for 1974, enough to maintain the house on Ocean Avenue and provide for a family of 7. He had a commanding presence, a booming voice that could fill a room or a showroom floor. 6 feet tall and broad-shouldered, Ronald Sr. was the kind of man who drew attention when he entered a space. He had a reputation for being tough but fair in business dealings, someone who'd give you an honest assessment of your car as problems and a fair price to fix them, someone who wouldn't let customers or employees take advantage, but who would work with you if you were struggling financially. Ronald Sr.'s background was solidly working-class Italian-American, the kind of trajectory that defined the American dream in the mid-20th century. His father had immigrated from Italy in the 1920s, arriving at Ellis Island with nothing but determination and a willingness to work any job available. He'd labored in construction, in factories, in any place that would hire him, saving every penny, learning English by listening to people more educated than himself, figuring out how America worked through trial and error and countless mistakes. That immigrant grandfather had instilled in Ronald Sr. the importance of work ethic, of showing up every day regardless of how you felt, of keeping your word and honoring your commitments. He'd taught him about family loyalty, about providing for your own before anyone else, about maintaining respect in the community, because reputation was everything when you came from nothing. He'd also taught him about discipline, about demanding obedience from your children, about being the unquestioned head of household. Ronald Sr. took those lessons to heart, maybe too much so. He demanded perfection from his children, especially his eldest son who bore his name and carried the weight of family expectations. Every B on Ronnie's report cards when he was young was interrogated. Every mistake was analyzed. Every failure was met with anger and disappointment rather than patience and understanding. Ronald Sr. had pulled himself up through sheer determination and couldn't understand why his son, who had every advantage, couldn't do the same. The fights between father and son were legendary in the neighborhood, loud enough that people 3 houses away could hear the screaming. Ronald Sr.'s booming voice, calling Ronnie worthless, a disgrace, a waste of everything the family had built. Ronnie screaming back, calling his father a tyrant, a bully, someone who'd driven him to drugs through impossible expectations and constant criticism. Both of them wrong, both of them right, both of them trapped in a dynamic they couldn't escape. His wife Louise was 42, a devoted Catholic mother who attended Mass at St. Martin of Tours every Sunday and most weekdays when she could manage it. She kept an immaculate home, the kind of spotless cleanliness that required hours of daily work. She tried desperately to hold her fractured family together, playing mediator between her husband and eldest son, protecting the younger children from the worst of the dysfunction, maintaining the appearance of normalcy for the outside world. Louise had been just 18 when she married Ronald Sr. 20 when Ronnie was born. She'd grown from girl to woman to mother, without much time to figure out who she was as an individual. Her identity was completely wrapped up in her roles, in being a good wife and devoted mother and dutiful daughter. She worked part-time keeping the dealership's books, handling paperwork and accounts with the same meticulous attention to detail she applied to her home. She was a small woman barely 5'4", with dark hair that she kept styled in the fashion of the era. Soft features that had once been beautiful, but that decades of stress had carved with worry lines and premature aging. She'd buried an infant son years earlier, a stillbirth that had devastated her, prayed endlessly for that child's soul, while wondering what she'd done to deserve such loss. She'd watched her surviving children grow, feeling joy when they succeeded and crushing guilt when they struggled. With Ronnie, she felt that guilt most intensely. What had she done wrong? How had she failed to raise him properly? Was it something during pregnancy, some sin or mistake that had marked him? The Catholic teaching about original sin and redemption, mixed with her Italian-American cultural beliefs about family honor and maternal responsibility, creating a toxic cocktail of guilt and shame that she carried constantly. These weren't monsters, weren't abusers in the conventional sense. They were flawed parents struggling with an increasingly violent, drug-addicted son while trying to raise 4 other children. Louise attended PTA meetings at the younger children's schools, volunteered at the church bake sales and fundraisers, worked part-time keeping the dealership's books with a precision that would have made her an accountant in a different era. Ronald Sr. coached Little League when his younger sons Mark and John were small, teaching them to throw and catch and hit, trying to give them the childhood experiences he'd never had growing up poor in Brooklyn. Their families had known each other for decades. Ronald Sr.'s parents and Louise's parents had been neighbors in Brooklyn, attending the same church, their children playing together on the same streets. The marriage had been expected, almost arranged in the informal way Italian-American families managed such things in the 1950s. They weren't enemies, weren't people who hated each other, just parents watching their eldest sons spiral into addiction and violence while feeling powerless to stop it. The other children complicated the situation. Dawn was 18, a recent high school graduate who worked as a hostess at a local restaurant while figuring out her next steps. She was beautiful like her mother had been at that age, with blonde hair that neither parent could explain and a sweet nature that made her popular with customers. She wanted out of the house, away from the constant tension between her brother and her father, but felt guilty about abandoning her mother and younger siblings. Allison was 13, in that awkward stage between childhood and adolescence, dealing with school and friends and all the normal teenage concerns, while also navigating a home life that was anything but normal. She'd learned to make herself invisible when Ronnie and their father fought, to retreat to her room and read or listen to music on the transistor radio she kept under her pillow. She was a good student. Teachers loved her. She represented hope that the next generation of DeFeos would turn out better than Ronnie had. Mark was 11 and John was 9. Still young enough to believe their parents could protect them from anything. Still naive about how dangerous their older brother had become. They idolized their father despite his stern demeanor, wanted to be like him, work hard like him, make him proud like Ronnie never had. They tolerated Ronnie with the wariness kids develop toward unpredictable adults, never quite sure which version. They'd get the charming older brother who'd play with them, or the violent drug addict who'd scream at them for minor infractions. Ronald Sr.'s father had survived the Depression by doing whatever it took to feed his family, working multiple jobs simultaneously, sleeping 4 hours a night for years. Ronald Sr. swore he'd give his children better opportunities, easier lives, college educations if they wanted them, everything he'd never had. He'd succeeded financially, but failed as a father to his eldest son, though he'd never admit it, never acknowledged that his parenting style had contributed to Ronnie's problems. Too much comfort, too much money handed to a child who hadn't earned it, too few consequences for bad behavior, because Louise always interceded, always pleaded for one more chance. That's how Ronald Sr. explained Ronnie's failures. Not his own impossible expectations, not his constant criticism, not his use of physical discipline that crossed lines into abuse, not his inability to show affection or approval. Just that Ronnie had been given too much and appreciated too little. Times were different, Ronald Sr. would say. His generation had been raised with discipline, and look how they turned out. This new generation with their permissive parenting and participation trophies was creating weak men who couldn't handle adversity. The fact that he'd been far from permissive, that he'd beaten Ronnie regularly as a child for infractions both real and imagined, never factored into his analysis. Louise knew better, but couldn't say so. She'd seen the bruises on young Ronnie, heard the screaming, watched her husband lose control, and strike their son with fists or belts or whatever was handy. She'd interceded when she could, but mostly she'd stayed quiet, because in her world, a woman didn't question her husband's authority over the children. She'd prayed instead, endless rosaries begging God to fix what she couldn't, to heal her family, to save her son before it was too late. By November 1974, both parents were exhausted. They'd tried everything they could think of. They'd tried discipline, and it had failed. They'd tried leniency, and it had failed. They'd tried bribing Ronnie with money and privileges, threatening him with consequences, begging him to get clean. Nothing worked. He was 23 years old, legally an adult, and they couldn't force him into treatment or out of their house without his cooperation. So they lived in a state of constant tension, waiting for the next crisis, hoping it wouldn't be catastrophic, but increasingly certain that catastrophe was inevitable. They just never imagined it would come the way it did in the early morning hours of a cold November night, with their eldest son moving through their home with a rifle and cold determination. The trouble had been building for years, not days. Ronnie's drug use had escalated from marijuana to heroin by his early 20s, a progression that destroyed any remaining hope his parents had for his recovery. His violence toward family members had progressed from teenage tantrums to genuine threats that left everyone in the house walking on eggshells, never knowing what would trigger the next explosion. He'd pointed guns at his father multiple times over the previous 2 years. The first time, during an argument about money in the summer of 1972, Ronald Sr. had actually called the police. The responding officers had talked to Ronnie, confiscated the weapon temporarily, but within days, the gun was back and no charges were filed. Louise had begged the police not to arrest her son, promising it would never happen again, promising they'd get him help. He'd beaten his younger siblings on multiple occasions. Mark had a scar on his forehead from being thrown into a doorframe during one of Ronnie's drug-fueled rages. Allison had learned to lock her bedroom door at night, a chair propped under the handle for extra security, because Ronnie sometimes prowled the house at 3 in the morning, high and paranoid and dangerous. Dawn had moved out briefly at 17, but returned when she realized her mother couldn't protect the younger children alone. He'd terrorized his mother with threats that grew increasingly specific and disturbing. He'd told her he could kill them all in their sleep, and no one would stop him. He'd told her the house was possessed, that demons spoke to him, that they demanded blood sacrifice. He'd told her that one day he'd snap, and it would be her fault for not loving him enough, for not protecting him from his father, for choosing the other children over him. Louise had tried to get him committed for psychiatric evaluation. She'd consulted with a lawyer about involuntary commitment procedures. But in 1974, the laws protected individual liberty over family safety. Unless Ronnie had actually harmed someone badly enough to require hospitalization, unless he'd been arrested and convicted of a serious crime, unless he'd attempted suicide, the mental health system couldn't hold him against his will. And Ronnie was smart enough to avoid crossing those specific lines, at least until it was too late. The dealership incidents had been escalating too. In September, Ronnie had been caught stealing cash from the register, $1,800 over several weeks. His grandfather Rocco had confronted him, and Ronnie had responded with threats of violence, telling the old man that he'd burn the dealership down if he was fired. Rocco, tired of making excuses for his troubled grandson, had told Ronald Sr. that Ronnie was one more incident away from being permanently banned from the property. In October, coworkers had found heroin needles in the bathroom Ronnie used. The company policy was clear: immediate termination for drug use on premises, but family connection trumped policy once again. Ronnie was suspended for a week without pay, given another warning, told this was absolutely the last chance. He'd return to work high the following Monday, his contempt for consequences so complete that he didn't even try to hide his condition. On November 12, 1974, the day before the murders, everything was tense, but not unusual by the DeFeo family's warped standards of normal. Ronnie had shown up to work late, arriving at 11 when his shift started at 8. He'd been sent home early by his grandfather for being high, nodding off at his desk, unable to string coherent sentences together when customers approached with questions. Rocco had told him not to come back until he was clean, knowing that meant Ronnie probably wouldn't come back at all, finally ready to sever the employment relationship, even if it meant family drama. He'd returned to 112 Ocean Avenue around 2 in the afternoon, the large Dutch colonial the family had purchased in 1965 for $30,000, a steal even then for waterfront property. The house had 3 floors, 6 bedrooms, a boathouse out back, everything a growing family could want. It had been a symbol of their success, of having made it, of providing stability for their children. Now it felt like a prison, walls that trapped them with an increasingly violent addict who refused help and could not be forced to leave. Ronnie had immediately gotten into an argument with his father about money, about work, about his complete lack of responsibility. Ronald Sr., home early himself because it was a slow Tuesday at the dealership, had confronted his son in the living room. The argument followed familiar patterns, each man hitting the same notes they've been hitting for years, neither willing to back down, or admit fault, or try something different. Ronald Sr. demanding to know when Ronnie would grow up, get clean, contribute something meaningful to the family that had supported him for 23 years, despite his constant failures. Ronnie screaming that his father had never loved him, had always been a tyrant, had driven him to drugs through impossible expectations and constant criticism. Louise trying to mediate, begging them both to calm down, to talk like rational people, to remember they were family. Not just that argument, but weeks and months and years of arguments condensed into 90 minutes of screaming, of threats, of ultimatums that would never be enforced. Every conversation about getting clean, about contributing to the household, about respecting his mother, about setting an example for his younger siblings, about being a man instead of a perpetual child. All of it condensed into one more screaming match in the comfortable living room of their waterfront home, while neighbors heard nothing through the thick walls and manicured distance between properties that allowed privacy to become isolation. The argument ended with Ronald Sr. telling Ronnie to get out, to leave and not come back until he was ready to live like a member of the family instead of a parasite. It was an empty threat, they both knew it, uttered in 100 previous arguments and never enforced. Louise wouldn't let her husband actually kick out their eldest son. Where would Ronnie go? How would he survive? What if something happened to him and she'd never forgiven herself? Ronnie had stormed to his second-floor bedroom, slamming the door hard enough to rattle pictures on the wall. Ronald Sr. had retreated to the basement workshop where he kept tools and projects, somewhere to go when the house felt too small and the family too overwhelming. Louise had gone to the kitchen to start dinner, hands shaking as she peeled potatoes, wondering how much longer they could continue like this, how many more arguments the family could withstand before something broke permanently. Ronnie stood in that living room for 20 minutes after his father went to the basement, just staring at the staircase leading up to the bedrooms. The voices in his head, which had been quiet whispers for months, were suddenly screaming. Kill them, they demanded. Kill them all before they destroy you. They're evil, possessed by demons. They need to be cleansed. You're the chosen one, the only one strong enough to do what's necessary. His breathing came shallow and fast. His hands opened and closed at his sides, fingers twitching with nervous energy or drug withdrawal or building rage. His pupils were dilated from the heroin still in his system, his perception altered, reality and delusion blurring together until he couldn't distinguish between actual voices and his own thoughts projected outward onto imaginary demons. When he finally went to his own room on the second floor around 4 in the afternoon, his mind had already made the calculations. Not specifically when or how, but the fundamental decision that his family needed to die. That he'd given them chances to treat him properly, and they'd failed. That the voices were right, that this was necessary, that he was chosen for this sacred task of elimination. There were voices in his head now, or so he'd later claim. Demonic voices telling him his family was evil, that they needed to die, that he was chosen for this sacred task. Whether those voices were real schizophrenic hallucinations, drug-induced psychosis, or convenient legal strategy constructed after the fact would be debated for decades. Psychiatrists would argue over diagnosis. Lawyers would argue over culpability. The jury would have to decide if demons or madness or cold calculation had motivated the killings. What wasn't debatable was that Ronnie DeFeo had clearly decided his entire family needed to die that very night. Sometime between that argument at 2 p.m. on November 12th and 3 a.m. on November 13th, when he pulled the first trigger, the decision crystallized from vague ideation into concrete plan. He would kill them all. Parents, siblings, everyone who'd wronged him or failed him, or simply had the misfortune of sharing his last name. There was no confrontation in the traditional sense. No dramatic showdown, no final warning, no chance for negotiation or escape. That's what made this different from revenge killings where both parties know the stakes. The DeFeo family went to bed on November 12, 1974, with no idea their lives were measured in hours. Ronald Sr. fell asleep watching television in the master bedroom around 11 p.m. Louise was already asleep beside him, exhausted from a day of errands and bookkeeping. Dawn DeFeo, 18 years old, a recent high school graduate working as a hostess at a local restaurant, was in her third-floor bedroom reading a magazine. Allison DeFeo, 13, was on the second floor, probably already asleep. Mark DeFeo, 11, and John DeFeo, 9, shared a second-floor bedroom, both long since settled into childhood dreams. Ronnie DeFeo was in his second-floor bedroom with his .35 caliber Marlin rifle, several boxes of ammunition, and a head full of whatever combination of drugs, psychosis, and rage had brought him to this moment. He'd owned that rifle for 3 years. His father had given it to him for hunting, never imagining it would be used for this. Around 3:15 a.m. on November 13th, Ronnie moved. No witnesses saw these moments. No one can say definitively what his expression was, what his exact thoughts were, whether he hesitated. What's known comes from the physical evidence, the autopsy reports, the blood spatter analysis, and Ronnie's own conflicting statements. The prosecution would later establish that he moved methodically, room by room, executing his sleeping family with cold efficiency. The defense would claim demonic possession, voices commanding him, a complete break from reality. The truth was probably somewhere in between. A young man who'd fantasized about this moment, rehearsed it mentally, and finally found whatever combination of courage and madness he needed to act. There was no traditional preparation period in this case, no elaborate planning, no methodical gathering of supplies over weeks. Ronnie DeFeo already had everything he needed. The rifle, the ammunition, the knowledge of his family's routines, the access to every bedroom in the house. What he did have was approximately 3 hours between making his final decision and taking his first action. 3 hours sometime between midnight and 3:15 a.m. to think about what he was planning to do. 3 hours to load the rifle, to check the ammunition, to walk the route he'd take through the house, to imagine each kill. Louise was already in bed, had been for hours. She'd given up trying to control Ronnie years ago, focused her energy on the younger children, on maintaining some semblance of normalcy. Ronald Sr. was a heavier sleeper, exhausted from long work days, comfortable in the bed he'd paid for with decades of hard work. The children's bedrooms were scattered across the second and third floors of the house. Dawn on the third floor in her own space, establishing teenage independence. Allison, Mark, and John on the second floor near the parents' master bedroom. Close enough to hear if they screamed. Close enough that he'd have to be silent, efficient, deadly. Ronnie thought about prison, had to have thought about it. New York had the death penalty until 1963. But by 1974, it was life in prison at maximum. 23 years old. Even if he got life, he'd die in prison. Never see freedom again, except through bars during recreation hours. Never see the Bay again. Never walk as a free man. All of that gone for this. He could stop. Could put the rifle back in his closet. Could go to bed. Could wake up tomorrow and pretend these thoughts never existed. Could move out, could leave his family behind and start somewhere else. Let time and distance handle what violence couldn't. But then he thought about every argument with his father, every perceived slight, every moment of feeling controlled and disrespected. Thought about Louise's disappointed looks when he came home high or drunk. Thought about his younger siblings living the lives he couldn't, succeeding where he'd failed, being the children his parents actually wanted. No, some things mattered more than freedom, more than life itself. Power, control, the ultimate act of dominance. Proving he could do something they couldn't stop, couldn't prevent, couldn't take back. Ronald DeFeo loaded the Marlin rifle with 8 rounds, chambered the first, and moved toward the master bedroom. There was no turning back now. November 12th evening, the DeFeo family's last night alive had been unremarkable by their standards. Ronald Sr. had come home from work around 6 p.m., complained about a difficult customer, eaten dinner that Louise had prepared, spaghetti and meatballs, his favorite. The children had finished homework, watched television, bickered over what channel to watch. Dawn had plans to go out with friends the next day. She'd told Louise about a new boy she was interested in, someone from work who'd asked her to a movie. Louise had smiled, given motherly advice, felt that small spark of hope that at least one of her children would have a normal, happy life. Allison had shown Louise a paper she'd gotten an A on, a book report for English class. Louise had praised her, proud that her daughter was such a good student, so different from Ronnie at that age. Mark and John had played with toy cars in their room, building elaborate racetracks, their voices carrying through the house in that particular way children's laughter does. Even Ronnie had seemed relatively normal that evening, quieter than usual, but not threatening. He'd eaten dinner with the family, something he often skipped. He'd watched television with them for a while, before retreating to his room around 10 p.m. Louise had taken that as a good sign, him engaging with the family, being present. Ronald Sr. had fallen asleep, believing his family was safe. Louise had prayed before bed, thanking God for another day, asking for guidance with Ronnie, for patience and wisdom. She'd checked on the younger children before going to bed, a nightly ritual she never skipped. Dawn had stayed up later reading, teenage mind wandering to possibilities, to college maybe, to the life she'd build away from the tension that permeated 112 Ocean Avenue. She'd finally turned off her light around midnight, settled into sleep with no idea these were her last conscious moments. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue was silent by 12:30 a.m. 6 people sleeping, 1 person awake with a loaded rifle, and the dark waters of the Amityville River flowing past the backyard, indifferent to what was about to happen in that comfortable Dutch colonial. At approximately 3:15 a.m. on November 13, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. stood outside his parents' bedroom door on the 2nd floor of 112 Ocean Avenue. The house was completely dark, except for a nightlight in the hallway. Temperature inside was comfortable, heat set to 68 degrees, the hum of the furnace, the only sound besides his own breathing. Through the partially open door, he could hear his father's snoring, that deep rhythmic sound of a man in deep sleep after a long day of work. His mother made no sound, sleeping on her side facing away from the door. The bedroom smelled like his mother's perfume, his father's aftershave, the familiar sense of the people who'd raised him. Ronnie's breathing came slow and steady. He'd expected fear, expected hesitation, or maybe last-minute doubt. Instead, he felt nothing but cold purpose, like he'd already stepped outside himself, like he was watching Ronald DeFeo Jr., the one about to become something he could never come back from a great distance. "This is it," he whispered to the voices only he could hear. No turning back. The voices in his head, if they existed, if they were real and not fabricated for his defense, allegedly responded with approval, with encouragement, with demonic commands to complete his mission. Whether that was psychotic break or calculated performance, we'll never know with certainty. Ronnie pushed the door open wider, the well-oiled hinges making no sound. His parents had paid for this house, maintained it meticulously, never imagining their attention to home maintenance would allow their son to kill them silently. He raised the Marlin rifle, aimed it at his father's back from approximately 5 feet away. Ronald DeFeo Sr., 43 years old, service manager, father of 5, devoted son, hard-working provider, sleeping peacefully in the bed he'd earned through decades of honest work. One shot, loud in the confined space, but muffled by the house's solid construction. The sound was later described by ballistics experts as being audible outside the house, but easy to dismiss as a car backfiring or a firecracker. Ronald Sr. died instantly, the bullet entering his lower back and causing catastrophic internal damage. Louise DeFeo woke to the sound, to her husband's body jerking beside her, to the realization that something terrible was happening. She may have started to turn, started to speak, started to scream. The second shot cut off whatever sound she made. Louise DeFeo, 42 years old, devoted Catholic, mother of 5, amateur bookkeeper, PTA volunteer, died in the bed she'd shared with her husband for over 20 years. Ronnie stood in that bedroom for 30 seconds, just watching, making sure neither parent would rise again. His hands were steady. His breathing was calm. Some part of him had already accepted that he was no longer Ronnie DeFeo, the disappointing eldest son. He was Ronald DeFeo, the family annihilator, and there were 4 more murders to commit before sunrise. 3:17 a.m. The master bedroom reeked of gunpowder and blood. Temperature in the house remained 68 degrees. The furnace had kicked on, masking any sound Ronnie made moving through the hallway. The only sounds were his footsteps on the carpeted hallway, the creak of floorboards that every old house makes, and the rifle in his hands feeling heavier now, more real now that it was no longer theoretical violence, but actual killing. Dawn's bedroom was on the 3rd floor, up a narrow staircase, isolated from the rest of the house. Ronnie climbed those stairs, the Marlin rifle pointed ahead of him. Through her bedroom door, he could see her sleeping, face down in her bed, blonde hair spread across the pillow. Dawn DeFeo was 18 years old. She'd graduated high school just months earlier. She had plans, dreams, a whole life stretching ahead of her. She'd been thinking about the boy from work, about the movie they might see, about whether she'd let him hold her hand in the theater. Ronnie stood in her doorway. This was his sister, someone he'd grown up with, someone who'd never really wronged him, someone whose only crime was being part of the family he hated. The voices supposedly told him she was evil, that she needed to die, that this was righteous work. One shot to her back, fired from close range. Dawn died instantly, never waking, never knowing, dying with thoughts of teenage romance still lingering in her last moment of consciousness. She was discovered lying on her stomach, the way she preferred to sleep, the way she'd slept safely for 18 years until this moment. 3:19 a.m. 2 adults and 1 teenager dead. 4 more victims waiting in their beds, sleeping peacefully, trusting that the sounds they maybe half heard were nothing serious, nothing that required waking, nothing that threatened them. Ronnie descended the stairs from the 3rd floor, methodical, calm, the rifle hanging at his side now as he moved toward Allison's 2nd floor bedroom. The door was closed. He opened it quietly. Allison DeFeo was 13 years old. She'd gotten an A on her book report. She was a good student, kind to her younger brothers, helpful to her mother, the kind of daughter every parent hopes to raise. She slept on her side, facing the wall, blonde hair similar to Dawn's, small frame still holding on to childhood even as teenage years approached. The shot woke her, maybe. Medical examiners couldn't determine with certainty whether she regained consciousness in that split second between the bullet entering her body and death shutting down her brain. If she woke, it was to pain, confusion, and the sight of her older brother standing over her with a smoking rifle. 3:21 a.m. 3 dead, 3 more to go. The house remained eerily silent. Neighbors later reported hearing nothing, seeing nothing, suspecting nothing. The heavy construction of 1920s-era Dutch colonials, the distance between properties, the late hour when even light sleepers are deepest in sleep, all combined to provide Ronnie with the privacy he needed to complete his massacre. Mark and John DeFeo shared a bedroom on the 2nd floor, down the hall from their parents' room. They were 11 and 9 years old respectively, still young enough to share a room without complaint, to find comfort in each other as presents during storms or scary movies, or when they heard their parents and Ronnie fighting. Ronnie entered their room with the rifle raised. 2 beds, 2 sleeping children, 2 more family members who needed to die before his mission was complete. The voices, he'd later claim, were screaming at him now, demanding he finish the task, demanding total obedience. Mark DeFeo, 11 years old, who'd wanted to be a baseball player, who collected comic books, who'd begged his father to take him to a Yankees game all season. 1 shot, center mass, probably never woke up, dying in the same bed where he daydreamed childhood dreams and felt safe in his parents' house. John DeFeo, 9 years old, the youngest, the baby of the family, still believing the world was fundamentally good and parents could protect you from anything bad. The final shot of the massacre, the 6th and last murder, committed against a child who'd never harmed anyone, whose only mistake was being born into the DeFeo family in 1965. At 3:25 a.m., Ronald DeFeo Jr. stood in the hallway of 112 Ocean Avenue, rifle hanging at his side, looking at nothing in particular, looked at the walls his parents had painted, looked at the carpet they'd installed, looked at his hands, shaking now that it was over. A killer's hands. 6 people dead. His entire family eliminated in less than 15 minutes. The methodical execution of everyone who'd loved him, frustrated him, tried to help him, failed to save him from himself. All of them gone, bleeding out in their beds while he stood in the hallway, figuring out what to do next. Approximately 30 minutes after the last shot echoed through 112 Ocean Avenue, Ronnie DeFeo had cleaned himself up, hidden the rifle in clothing, and begun constructing the lie he'd tell the world. He didn't call the police immediately. That would come hours later, after he'd gone through an elaborate charade of normalcy. Around 6:30 p.m. that evening, more than 15 hours after the murders, Ronnie ran into Henry's bar in Amityville, shouting that someone had killed his family. He was frantic, convincing, seemingly in genuine shock. The bar patrons, including a friend named Joey Yeswit, rushed to 112 Ocean Avenue with him. Suffolk County Police received the call at 6:35 p.m. Detective Sergeant Robert Dunn arrived at 6:43 p.m. He was 38 years old, a 16-year veteran of the force, experienced enough to have seen death, but still young enough to believe that most people were fundamentally good, that monsters were rare exceptions. He'd grown up in nearby Babylon, requested assignment to homicide because he wanted to solve cases, to bring justice to victims. He got out of his vehicle at 6:45 p.m. Temperature was 42 degrees, sun already setting, casting long shadows across the well-maintained yard. His breath made small clouds in the air as he approached the house with weapon drawn. Then he saw the first body through a second-floor window. Dunn had seen murder scenes before. Bar fights turned lethal, domestic violence gone too far, the occasional gang killing that spilled over from Brooklyn. Nothing prepared him for what he found in 112 Ocean Avenue. 6 bodies, all shot in their beds, all lying face down in nearly identical positions, all executed with the same weapon at close range. The precision was disturbing. The methodical nature was terrifying. This wasn't rage, wasn't passion, wasn't chaotic violence. This was systematic elimination. The bodies had been lying there all day. Blood had soaked through mattresses, pooled on floors, dried in the warm house. The smell was overwhelming. That particular combination of death, blood, and bodily functions released in final moments. Dunn, hardened detective that he was, vomited in the master bedroom bathroom after seeing John DeFeo's small body. By 8 p.m., the news had spread through Amityville like wildfire. 6 dead. The DeFeo family wiped out. Ronnie claiming some mob hit, some mysterious intruder. Everyone had an opinion, and almost none of them agreed. Some people believed Ronnie was innocent, that he was a victim too, that someone had targeted the family for reasons unknown. Ronald Sr. dealt with money at the dealership, handled transactions. Maybe he'd crossed the wrong people. Louise kept the books. Maybe she'd seen something she shouldn't have. The mob angle seemed plausible to people who watched too many movies. Others immediately suspected Ronnie. His history of violence was well known in Amityville. His drug problems were common knowledge. His threats against his family had been witnessed by friends, relatives, neighbors. The idea that he finally made good on those threats seemed obvious to anyone who watched him deteriorate over the previous 5 years. The physical evidence quickly pointed to Ronnie. The rifle was found the next day, hidden in a storm drain near the house. His story about the timeline kept changing. He claimed to have been at work when the murders occurred, but coworkers contradicted him. He claimed to have discovered the bodies when he came home, but the medical examiner established they'd been dead for over 12 hours before he discovered him. 28 days after the murders, on December 11, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. was formally charged with 6 counts of second-degree murder. He'd initially confessed to police, then recanted, then confessed again with different details. His lawyers would eventually settle on an insanity defense, claiming demonic possession and voices from the house itself. The trial of Ronald DeFeo Jr. began on October 14, 1975, in a Riverhead, New York courtroom. A venue had been changed. There was no possibility of finding an impartial jury in Amityville, where everyone knew the DeFeos, where everyone had formed opinions, where local legends and facts had already blurred. 6 combined charges of second-degree murder. The prosecution had the rifle, the ballistics match, the timeline, Ronnie's conflicting statements, and the complete lack of evidence for any intruder or mob hit. The defense had psychiatric testimony about insanity, about voices, about demonic possession of both Ronnie and the house itself. The jury, 12 people from Suffolk County, who understood suburban life but hadn't lived in Amityville, deliberated for a single day after a 28-day trial. November 21, 1975, they returned their verdict. Guilty. All charges. All 6 counts. Sentencing came later. Ronald DeFeo Jr. received 6 consecutive sentences of 25 years to life, essentially ensuring he'd die in prison. When the judge read the sentences, Ronnie showed no emotion, no tears, no shock, just a slight nod, as if he'd known from the moment he pulled that first trigger that this was exactly where the path would lead. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue would become more famous for what came after than for the murders themselves. The Lutz family moved in 13 months after the massacre, lasted 28 days, and fled claiming paranormal activity. Their story became the Amityville Horror, a best-selling book and blockbuster movie that overshadowed the real tragedy of 6 murdered people. Ronald DeFeo Jr. served 47 years in Green Haven Correctional Facility and later Sullivan Correctional Facility. During that time, he filed multiple appeals, all denied. He gave countless interviews, each one telling a different version of events. He alternately claimed he'd done it alone, that his sister Dawn had helped him, that mob hitmen were responsible, that he was completely innocent. Guards said he was a model prisoner for the most part, quiet, kept to himself. He maintained regular correspondence with family members who survived him, aunts and uncles who visited occasionally, despite everything. On March 12, 2021, at 69 years old, Ronald DeFeo Jr. died of natural causes in the Albany Medical Center at 6:35 p.m. The Department of Corrections reported that his last coherent words were, "I'm sorry," though to whom he was apologizing, his victims or himself, remained unclear. He was buried in St. Charles Cemetery in Farmingdale, New York, with a simple marker. Ronald J. DeFeo Jr., 1951 to 2021. No mention of son, no mention of brother, just dates marking the beginning and end of a life that had transformed from promising child to family annihilator. The victims, Ronald Sr., Louise, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John DeFeo, are buried together in St. Charles Cemetery. Their graves are marked with a single monument listing all 6 names, a family reunited in death, forever remembered as the victims of America's most infamous family massacre. Visitors still leave flowers, 50 years later, mourning the loss of 6 innocent people whose only mistake was being related to a killer. The DeFeo Massacre has no heroes. It has a drug-addicted son with severe mental illness and a family who tried and failed to control him. It has a mental health system that failed at every level in 1974. No mandatory treatment for violent addicts. No clear path for families seeking help for adult children. No intervention until bodies started piling up. Was Ronald DeFeo Jr. a monster? Yes. He eliminated 6 people with premeditation and planning, systematically executing his sleeping family without trial, without mercy, without giving them any chance to defend themselves. Was he also a victim of untreated mental illness and a system that had no idea how to handle cases like his? Also, yes. The uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. And that is the most disturbing part of this story, because it forces us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. How many warnings does a family have to give before someone intervenes? How many threats? How many acts of violence? How many cries for help before the system acknowledges that voluntary treatment doesn't work for people who do and recognize they're re-sick? What responsibility do we bear as a society when we know someone is dangerous, but wait until they kill to take action? When does mental illness stop being an explanation and start being an excuse? Where's the line between a sick person who needs treatment and a criminal who needs punishment? And who gets to decide when someone has crossed that line? How do we reconcile the reality that Ronald DeFeo was both profoundly mentally ill and fully capable of planning and executing a complex crime? That he could be psychotic enough to hear demonic voices, but competent enough to hide evidence, construct alibis, and maintain his lies for hours under pressure? What about the house itself, 112 Ocean Avenue, which became more famous for fabricated hauntings than real murders? What does it say about our culture that we'd rather believe in demons and ghosts than confront the reality of mental illness and family dysfunction? That the Amityville Horror made millions, while the real victims are barely remembered? The line between victim and perpetrator, between illness and evil, between tragedy and crime, that line is thinner than we want to believe. And sometimes in the darkest moments, it disappears entirely. If this story made you think about mental illness, family dysfunction, and the failures of our intervention systems, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe to this channel for more true stories that challenge what we think we know about right and wrong, about sickness and evil, about how far ordinary people will go when mental illness goes untreated. Comment below. What should families do when they recognize someone is dangerous, but the legal system won't intervene until after violence occurs? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now somewhere in comfortable suburban homes where systems fail and mental illness takes hold. Until next time, remember the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One misdiagnosis, one failed intervention, one desperate family at a time.